Welcome to Healing Talks. It's Chad Gonzales. Hey, I just want to let you know, first of all, we had a tremendous weekend down in Beaumont, Texas. We did 3 services: Saturday night, Sunday morning, and Sunday night. And we saw a lot of miracles take place. We had one girl, this is probably the sweetest, and we've got video of this. It was a young girl, she was 7 years old, and the service had been going kind of late, and we were trying to get to everyone. And I'd made mention, hey, if there's people, you can't come back tomorrow, raise your hand, we'll get back there and minister to you. So there were some people in the back. We went back there and we're praying with them. And then this one little girl, she raised her hand. She's 7 years old. And I asked her what was wrong. She said she had fallen and she had hurt her leg and her hip. And so I just very gently just laid my hands on her shoulder and said a little something about the life of God. I don't remember exactly what, but I asked her afterwards, I said, so what do you think happened? And she said, well, Jesus healed me. And I said, well, let's run around a little bit. So I had her run a small little lap in the back of the auditorium. And then I grabbed her hand and we took off running around the front portion. And I looked down, I saw a big smile on her face. And we got to the front and I said, what's going on? And she's big smile, and she said, it doesn't hurt anymore. It doesn't hurt anymore. And so I had her tell everybody what had happened. But I didn't know the extent of it until afterwards. Her mom was stating that it was just a great miracle in her life because she had fallen, I think about a week prior to that, maybe 3 or 4 days prior to that, and they had heard a pop in her hip. And she hadn't been able to run and play outside. She hadn't been able to really get around much. And just a wonderful miracle took place in a 7-year-old. So that was wonderful. We also had a woman, she was sitting on the front, on the left side, and she had a curved spine. And her mother and her grandmother was sitting on either side of her. And before we did anything, I had the mom and the grandma check. Of course, they said that they already knew that it was curved. The mom showed me where it was curved in her back. And so I don't think that I laid hands on her, actually, because I was really pushing in that particular service. I was really pushing as far as people to become aware of who was on the inside of them and what they had available to them. And so I don't think I laid hands on her, but it was maybe, I don't know, 10 minutes, 5 or 10 minutes went by. I was ministering to some other people, and I came back and I asked, I said, hey, what's going on with your back? And the mother started feeling, and she said, oh my goodness, she said her back's straight. And so that was really cool. And we had some ears that were healed and some joints and all kind of wonderful stuff. It was just really, really fun. So I enjoy that type of stuff. But just to let you know what was going on this weekend, and then we are going to be in Bogota, Colombia next weekend for some miracle services. So thank you all that were praying for us this past weekend. And hey, we saw a few of you actually there. We had people come from California and Florida and several from Louisiana and Ohio come down to Beaumont, Texas for the meetings. So those of you, you know who you are. Thanks for coming. It was so good to see you and meet some new faces too. So hey, let us know where you're watching from. So good to see all the different states and different countries that are represented. And who we have here? We've got quite a few people on Facebook and YouTube joining in. Juan, Sarah, Christine, Judy, Stacy Hemfield, some of my good friends up there, Chris Bartell, Melinda. Thank you guys for joining in. Bob was there, and Beaumont drove all the way from Florida to be with us. I've got Christine in Canada, and Gerardo in Mexico, Judy in Missouri, Chris and Kim from Oregon. Awesome. Glad to have you guys. Hey, I wanted to let you know about something that we just got in. We're putting it into our online store. This is my little buddy here, and it's a little lion. It's got a little hooded shirt. We were going to get one that just had the t-shirt, but my son Jake, he said it'd be cooler if he had the one with the hoodie. So it's got a little hoodie, but usually when we go and do these meetings and stuff at our book table, we just have books and never really anything for the kids. And so we've got something for the kids, but also these are great instead of using what we call prayer cloths. that we lay hands on and we impart the anointing to, you can also use these cute little stuffed animals. And these are great not only for kids and teenagers, but adults like them too. And so we'll have these available. We just got them in actually today. And so they should be up and available on the website here in the next few days. But I think they're like $8 or something like that. But 6 inches tall, cute little lion. And on the front of the t-shirt, the little hoodie, it says Jesus heals. And so we're excited to get these in. And I've got a couple around here in my office and stuff too. So anyway, hey, let's get into tonight. I want to touch on some things that we touched on Sunday night. We were doing more of a training with a group down there, but there was just this piece that kept coming up in the prior services, and we spent a little time on it Sunday night. And as I was driving, I didn't fly, I drove, so I had almost an 8-hour drive to kind of think about some things. And I was just beginning to think about this more and more and began to see how big of a deal this is, how great of an importance it has in our faith life and in the area of healing. And then not just in the area of healing, I mean, it could be in the area of finances. It could be in our relationships, those type of things. And it comes down to this. This is what I want to talk about, is how big of a deal are we making these particular situations. And what it comes down to is, if you look at the way the world looks at things, the world has situations, circumstances, storms in this world kind of at a rated different categories of severity. And so if we talk about sickness and disease, you know this to be very true, that we look at, a cold as being very, very small, but we look at cancer as being very, very, very big. And the reason we know that to be true is, and this is just kind of real and raw, and not to necessarily step on anybody's toes or to make anybody feel condemned, but we have to talk about these things if we're going to start seeing better results. We know this to be true. We look at, a cold is small and a cancer is being really, really big. Why do we look at one as small and one as really, really big? Because we know the power of God is the same. And the same power that heals a cold is the same power that heals a headache. It's the same power that heals cancer. It's the same power that heals COVID. It's the same power, but we see them on different levels. And the reason we see them on different levels, especially when we talk about cancer, is because people will say, well, the reason cancer is a big deal because it can kill you. Well, but if we take a step back from that, in all reality, any sickness or disease could eventually kill you. A cold could turn into, a flu or pneumonia. And how many people do you know that's died of pneumonia? I know quite a few people that's died of pneumonia. I know quite a few elderly people, over the years that have died of pneumonia. Any sickness or disease could develop into other things, and it could kill you too. But the question is this: why do we look at some things as big and some things as small? I mean, even right now, people aren't really wanting to talk about it, but there's people that are dying from medications. They die from certain vaccinations, certain prescriptions. Some of these medications that people take, they can have some adverse reactions and people can die from them. I know of people that have died from those things. So, you could die from anything, but we make cancer to be such a big deal. And the problem is that what is a big deal for the world, it shouldn't be a big deal for the church. And I'm talking about just from the standpoint of our perception. We shouldn't be seeing things in the very same way that the world is seeing things. And we have to remember that, we're born of heaven. We're sent from heaven, sent into this world. Jesus said this in John 17. He said, as you have sent me into this world, I am sending them into this world. Well, to go into a place means you have to be outside of it. If you were to walk into a room, that means you were in another room, right? Well, for you to be sent into the world, that means you had to come from somewhere else. And I joke around a lot and say, when people ask me if I believe in aliens, I say yes, because I am one. And it's funny, but yet it's also true. We actually are. Jesus also said in John 17, he said, they are not of this world, just as I am not of this world. And then he went on to say that as you sent me, Father, into this world, I'm sending them into this world. So that means that you and I, as Christians, as born again children of God, united with Christ, we should see things in the world from a different perspective as the people of the world. So we shouldn't be viewing things in the very same way that the world sees things. And if we just get very real and raw about it, you and I, as those united with Christ, born from heaven, sent from heaven into this world, we shouldn't be seeing one disease greater than another disease. We shouldn't be seeing one physical issue greater than another physical issue. And you could even bring it into the financial area. You shouldn't be seeing believing God for $100 as any different as believing God for $1,000, because it's still the same God. It's still the same power. It's still the same grace, still the same favor. It's just money, right? And when it comes to sickness and disease, it's just disease, right? It's just disease. But we look at them as being big and as being small. And the reason that we do that is because we look at the severity of what something can do. Now, if you are a sinner, if you're someone who is outside of God, outside of Christ, then yeah, you probably would be looking at things as being more severe. But the reason the world looks at things as more severe is because they look at it as these are things that I can fix and these are things that I can't. So when it comes to a cold or comes to a headache or something like that, the world doesn't think it is very severe because, I can just go pop a Tylenol or get an Advil or aspirin or whatever. I can take one of those and that's going to help take care of it. Well, when it comes to cancer or, say COVID or some other thing that's going on and there's really no answer for some of these maybe chronic illnesses or something like that, people look at it as very severe because there really isn't much of an answer. And so because there isn't much of an answer, people get afraid, they get anxious. Why? Because they're relying on self. It all comes down to what can I do about this situation? And we're viewing it from a very cursed standpoint because that's the way the world views it, from this cursed world. But you and I aren't of this cursed world. We're born of heaven. And so we should be seeing things differently. And this is the reason that Paul tells us in Romans chapter 12 and verse 2, he says, do not be conformed to this world, right? He says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Actually, I want to pull this up in I want to read this to you in the Message translation. It's really, really good. Let me find this. Romans 12. This is what he says here. This is the Message. It's really, really good. He said, don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God, for you'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what he wants from you and quickly respond to it. And like the culture all around you that's always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you and develops well-formed maturity in you. I like that. He said, don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. If you're going to go just off of that, there's a whole lot of us that aren't even thinking about what's going on. We've just become so well adjusted to our culture. And yet when we become born again, when we become in Christed, we become brand new, born of heaven, sent from heaven. And yet because we've grown up in the culture of the world and become adjusted to the culture of the world, we have to start renewing our mind and changing the way that we think. And so that's why Paul says, don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed. Or you could say, be conformed to the world that you're from. How? By changing the way that you think, changing the way that you see, change your perspective. And then notice the last phrase. It's so vitally important. He said, change your perspective, change the way that you think so that you can prove the will of God. See, we know what the will of God is. The will of God is heaven on earth. The way it is in heaven, that's what God wants in your life on this earth. But just because it's God's will, It doesn't mean it's automatically going to happen. Paul's letting you know, unless you change the way that you think, you're not going to see the will of God proved out in your life. That's kind of a bold thing, kind of a harsh thing, but it's real. It's the real deal. And it's the reason we make things to be a big deal when it's really not to God. Because we have fit in and we've adjusted to the culture and the perspective and the focus of the world is making things small and then making certain diseases and certain sicknesses and situations as a big deal. But the reason, again, it's a big deal to the world is because they don't have an answer for it. But we as Christians, we always have an answer for it because the answer is Jesus. He's always the way. He is the way. He's always the way. He's always the answer to experiencing heaven in that situation. But if we want to do that, we got to think differently. We have to see differently. We have to see according to the perspective of heaven because we shouldn't be seeing things the way that the world sees them. We've talked about this before that we can be saved in our spirit, but if we have cursed thinking, in other words, we're seeing according to the world, according to their cursed ways, we can be saved in our spirit, but if we have cursed thinking, then we are going to have cursed results, even though we've been redeemed from the curse of the law. It's kind of a sad statement, but it's still a true statement. It's sad because so many of us have been walking in and experiencing the results of the world, even though we've been saved from the effects of it. But again, it comes down to this. If I don't change the way that I think, if I don't start seeing things properly, seeing things according to the ideals and the perspective of heaven, then I'm still going to have the same type of results. I'm going to be looking at things as big and looking at things small, even though I've been redeemed from all of those things. In the eyes of God, it's all small. In the eyes of God, because of what Jesus did, it's already whipped. Remember what Jesus said? He said, in this world, you're going to face some troubles, but take courage, be happy, put a smile on your face because I've already conquered all of it. So even from that perspective, if we know that Jesus already conquered it, why would I make a big deal out of a certain situation? Why would I make a big deal out of one doctor's report and then not make a big deal out of another report? Well, again, when it comes to cancer, people would say, well, the reason it's a big deal is because you could die from it. Well, this this is going to sound really kind of warped, but it's not. It's truth. But what's the worst that could happen? I mean, honestly, what's the worst that you could happen? Well, you could die. Okay. Is death really that big of a deal? And I know some of us, our brains are turning a little bit and like, well, yeah, it's a big deal. But no, not really. It's really not that big of a deal. But the reason we make it a big deal is that, well, I don't want to die. Yeah, but the reason we make it a big deal is because being with Christ, going to heaven, those things aren't really that real to us. And so that's why we make a big deal about death. We make a big deal about it. And because we make a big deal about it, then when it comes to cancer, when it comes to some of these chronic illnesses or things that there aren't really answers for, then we freak out about it and we get in fear about it. And then we start trying to operate from a place of faith because I don't want to die. Well, please understand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that cancer, that it's not serious and there aren't, implications there. And I mean, I know people have gone through stuff. I've seen the struggles. I've seen just the horrible, horrible junk that cancer does to the body and how it's ripped apart families and things of that nature. I mean, I've got a lot of compassion for people who have gone through that. I've seen it. I've been with people through that. So I'm not making light of that. But what I'm trying to do is to get us to all take a step back and then really begin to look through the eyes of God concerning the situation instead of looking through the eyes of the sinner who's without God. In all reality, according to heaven, cancer is not a big deal. COVID is not a big deal. But you have to understand that the bigger of a deal you make it, then from your perspective, the greater faith you're going to need. And the greater faith that you're going to need and the bigger of a situation it's going to seem to you, then then the greater of a crowd that you're going to feel like you need to pray. And I bring this up a lot, but I mean, we need to think about this. When's the last time that you saw, we're not going to talk about ourselves, but you saw someone get on Facebook and ask people to start praying for your friend or praying for a loved one because they have a cold? When's the last time we had a prayer chain for a cold, or had a prayer chain for a headache, or had a prayer chain for, a skin rash or a snotty nose? But when's the last time you saw a prayer chain getting all the people we can possibly get together to pray and bombard the gates of heaven for cancer? Well, why do we do that? I mean, yeah, obviously we care. We're not diminishing that. But in reality, why do we do that? It's because, number one, we think it's a big deal. According to the world, it is. It's a big deal. We think it's a big deal. And number two, it's so big of a deal to us, we think we've got to get a whole bunch of people to pray to try to convince God to do something. Well, why do we not think we need a whole bunch of people to convince God to heal someone of a cold? Same God, same power, because we see it as very small. We see it as insignificant. And yet you have to understand that your response to a situation, it's going to reveal your perspective. Think about that. That's a powerful statement. Write that down. Your response to it, because I'm going to write that down too when we get done. But your response to a situation, it truly does reveal your perspective on the situation. Your perspective is going to reveal your response is going to reveal your perspective on that situation. And so the greater the situation is going to seem to you, the greater faith that you're going to think that it needs. And the more people start getting around. We don't see people do prayer chains and trying to bombard the gates of heaven, interceding and doing all these things for the little things. And yet sickness is sickness. Sin is sin. Sickness is sickness. Storm's a storm. It's all the same. And we have to see it as the same. And I bring this up a lot because it's a great example. But, when you understand that, sin and sickness have the same weight in the world, and because of the curse, well, we never do prayer chains. We never start calling everybody and say, hey, I need you to pray that God would forgive me, right? And then, of course, we brought it up. We don't pray. We won't start calling people and tell people to pray because I've got a headache or I've got a cold or something like that. But when it comes to something that's serious in the world, then we do that. And so there's a problem in the church when we respond to world problems in the very same way that the world does, because we're responding like people who do not have God. We're responding like people who are far outside of God. We're responding like people who are not united with Christ. This is pretty rough, but we're responding like people who are actually united with the devil. Because if you're not saved, that's who you're united to. And we're responding like that. We don't want to respond like that. Why? Because we don't want those type of results. We don't want those type of results. Now, look, before we go, I want to look at Jesus. And I didn't mean to spend this much time talking about cancer and death, but we need to talk about it. I brought it up, I think it was Sunday morning. And, coming up, I believe it's October, but coming up, it's Cancer Awareness Month. And, people wear ribbons and they do all these things, and talking about cancer and talking about cancer and talking about cancer and the effects of cancer. And this person died of cancer and that person died of cancer. And you know what that does? I get it. People are talking about, their loved ones that they've lost and this and that. But what that does is it does create a greater awareness of cancer. But it's not from necessarily a positive standpoint. Now, people of the world are doing it. I get it from a good heart and raising money and this and that. But from the general standpoint, where the devil stands, it creates a greater awareness because it creates a greater fear of cancer and the bigness of cancer in this world. Because cancer is a big deal and it kills lots of people. And unfortunately, it has. But at some point in this thing called life, you and I, the church, the body of Christ, we have to grab a hold of who we are, where we're from, who's on the inside of us, and respond like Jesus. Remember back in back in the 90s? People had before we had these rubber bands, people had those other bracelets and stuff, and it said WWJD, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do? And so many times we talked about it and respond to responding to people and if they hurt us or forgiving them or this and that. But how would Jesus respond to the storms of life? How did Jesus respond to cancer? How did Jesus respond to what the world considered serious situations? How did Jesus respond to death? Well, one that comes to mind is that of Jairus and his daughter. Remember in Mark chapter 5 when Jairus comes to Jesus and is begging Jesus to come to his house because his daughter's sick and at the point of death. And so Jesus says he'll come. And notice Jesus' response. Jairus tells him, it's a pretty serious situation according to the world. But we don't see Jesus turn around and run and say, oh, we've got to hurry up. We've got to get there before she dies. Jesus doesn't go, oh my goodness, that's so serious. Sorry everybody, we got to get out of here. We got to get there now. We don't see that. So much so do we not see that when the woman with the issue of blood comes up and interrupts it, Jesus doesn't turn around and say, hey, everybody leave me alone. This is a serious situation. This is a big deal. We've got to get there and handle it. No, the woman touches him. Jesus feels power come out. And instead of just continue to walk, he stops, turns around, begins to talk to her, ministers to her a little bit. And by that point, a servant of Jairus comes up and says, I'm so sorry, but don't bother him anymore. Your daughter's died. And we don't see Jesus again respond like the world would respond, and unfortunately respond the way the vast majority of the church would respond, in panic and in fear. And that's why for so many of us, when it comes to the big situations, our faith doesn't work because we're responding from a standpoint of fear instead of responding from a standpoint of victory. See, when we're truly in faith, we're going to be at peace about the situation. And there's still going to be joy there. The Bible tells us, it says, may the God of hope fill you with all peace and joy in believing. Fill you with all peace and joy in believing. So if we're truly in faith about the situation, we're going to be in peace about it. And you know how we respond to little situations? We have peace about it. And we tell people, oh, don't worry about it. It's not that big of a deal. Right? Well, but that should be our response even to the big things in life. Oh, don't worry about it. It's not that big of a deal. It's not that big of a deal. And that's the way that we see Jesus respond to this situation. Again, not taking away from the hurt or the pain of someone who's suffered and someone who's died or lost a child or experienced things like that. But we're talking about from this standpoint because we want to be able to help people. And it's high time we start getting results exactly like Jesus. But we're not going to get results exactly like Jesus if we don't start seeing like him and responding in the very same way. But we're not going to respond properly if we're not seeing things properly. So Jesus hears this news that the daughter has died. And he turns around and looks at Jairus and he says, do not be afraid, only believe. Don't be afraid. We're not going to operate out of fear. We're not going to respond from fear. And then we don't see Jesus take off running, do we? No. They just continue on their journey. And when they get there, what does Jesus do? We do not see Jesus come up to the house with all the people and tell them, hey, we've got to start praying. We need a miracle. We don't see Jesus do that at all. Actually, he kicked everybody out. So I've never heard anybody talk about this before. This thought just came to me, but this is a pretty good example because we don't see Jesus gather a bunch of people together to pray for God to do something regarding this death here, do we? And even if it needed a whole bunch of people, we don't see Jesus gather a bunch of people. Actually kicks everybody out, and then he just takes him, Peter, John, James, and the parents, and that's it. And they walk in there, but even Jesus doesn't tell them to pray. He doesn't tell them to do anything. Why? Because Jesus knew he was the answer. And yet, it's always so vitally important to remember Jesus is doing this as a man. He's doing this with a brain like you, a soul like you, a body like you. He's doing this like us. And he did not respond the way that we respond so many times. And I'm including myself in there because been there, done that. And seeing things as big. And it's one of the things I'm working on in my mind, renewing my mind, to not see things that are big in this world, to see them all very, very small. Because if they're big, too many times our response is different and we think we're going to need greater faith, greater power, greater anointing. But Jesus' response to this situation was no different. You'll see no different here in this situation of death than it was with someone who was blind or someone who was deaf or someone who was a leper. Jesus goes in there in command of the situation. And he goes in there and he doesn't say some long prayer. He doesn't say that we need to fast and pray for 21 days to get a result. He doesn't even say we need a miracle. He just goes in there because he is a miracle waiting to happen. And he commands the girl to rise up. And she does. So I'm not saying that we've all arrived there. All of us, including myself, we have a ton of work to do when it comes to renewing our mind and changing the way that we think and changing the way that we see so that we respond properly. We don't want to be responding in fear because too many people are calling it faith and making faith confessions and quoting the right scriptures, but they're doing it from a standpoint of fear. And in all reality, if you're somebody and you've got a serious condition according to the doctors and they said we can't help you and you're going to die, something like that. Well, in all reality, this may sound a little strange, and we'll finish up here, but in all reality, I shouldn't be trying to get healed just so that I don't die. In all reality, I should want to be healed, not because I'm afraid to die. I should want to be healed because I still have work to do. And there's still people depending on me, but ultimately, I've got work to do. I've got things that I need to do for God. I've got things I've got to do in this kingdom. And until I get those things accomplished, I'm not going anywhere. Until I get those things accomplished. So that's the reason I'm going to stand against whatever's coming against me. That's the reason I'm not going to make it that big of a deal, because it's not that big of a deal. We've made Satan to be a big deal. It's like we serve, a little God and we're fighting against a big devil. But we have to remember that Jesus took the keys of death, hell, and the grave, right? And he conquered Satan, and he took him on a victory parade. He stripped him of all of his power and authority over us. He has nothing on us. So why are we making him out to be a big deal? And if Satan isn't a big deal, and we've already been set free from him, that means we've already been set free from everything else that comes from him. Satan comes to kill, steal, and destroy. So anything that comes to kill, steal, and destroy, we've already been set free from it. We've already been declared victorious over it. It's not that big of a deal. I know it sounds strange. We've got to start thinking like that. It's not that big of a deal. Cancer is not that big of a deal. COVID-19, 20, whatever, 21, it's not that big of a deal. Now, the media may make it a big deal. Friends, I'm telling you, from the perspective of heaven and everybody there, it's not that big of a deal. The fear of something will kill you quicker than the actual disease. That's just my perspective on it. The fear is what opens up the door to kill people. So stop making a big deal out of everything. Stop being afraid and so anxious and worried about everything. Let's be people of faith. Let's be people of peace. Let's be people of joy, and let's see things the way that Jesus sees them so we can set people free and we can manifest Jesus to our world. Praise God. Well, hey, I trust that helped you. That got me a little stirred up. I'm going to go back and take some notes. There's a couple of things that I said I'm going to go back and write down and look at a few things. But hey, make sure and share this with your friends. Hey, Chris, I agree. Share this with your friends, and if you haven't, let us know where you're watching. We always enjoy seeing all the different countries and everyone that's represented. All of you that are watching Facebook, YouTube, thank you very much. And we'll talk to you next Tuesday night, 7 p.m. Central, right here on Facebook and YouTube. Love you guys. Remember, in Christ, We always win. We'll talk to you next time.